Welcome to this introduction to knitting pattern reading. Knitting patterns are, at their core, just a set of instructions that you follow in order to knit a particular item. And the reason that there are knitting patterns is that not everybody wants to freestyle knit, so you don't want to make up things as you go, or there's something that you start out with and then progress on to do your own designs, etc. But lots of people always knit exactly what the knitting pattern tells them, and then they get exactly the outcome that they're expecting. And that's one of the really great things about knitting patterns. Someone else does the design, and then you just get to do the knitting, which is awesome. The question I get asked a lot is there a standard? So do they look the same all the time? And the answer is there is and there isn't. So there are many standard knitting terms, and you'll often see a standard set of content and patterns, but most designers will put their own spin on their patterns. So for example, I have a particular layout I like, I have a particular style I follow, and they're very much my own, but they're generally related to patterns that you'll see for other people. So yes, there's a standard, but there are quite a few differences within that, if that makes sense. There's no need to get too caught up in that though, because you will over time see lots of knitting patterns, and a bit like knitting, you get used to them, and as you see new things you learn what they are, and then you'll just progress on through it. It's a bit like learning to read. So I don't know how it is in where you're from, but where I grew up in Ireland, we learned how to read using Anne and Barry books. So our first readers were Anne and Barry, and both of them had, well, Anne had a yellow car I think, and Barry had a red lorry. And like I've progressed on from there to much better books, but I started with, Anne has a red car, and knitting patterns are exactly the same. You don't launch straight into the middle of something very difficult, although you can if you want. You start and you progress through them. So when you see something that looks a bit intimidating, don't worry, you will get there. So the next thing to look at is what is actually included in a knitting pattern. The vast majority of patterns will provide you with a standard set of information. So in this case, you have yarn, needles, and notions. You have sizes and gauge, abbreviations, and then you'll also get other details. So the yarn is the yarn that you're going to use. So it's the same yarn that the designer used, all going well, to produce the pictures of the item that you're seeing in the pattern. So for example, it might say use Banshee yarns, silky sock, 4mm needles, and you'll only need half of the skein, so 50 grams of it. You'll see various amounts of details. When you see notions, it means you're going to see maybe stitch markers, a scissors, a darning needle, etc. Sometimes they'll include more and some will include less. They might not include everything you need, but that's that's one of the joys of knitting. You might see block your item, in which case you do need things to be able to block your item, but they might not have told you all of the details of that in the pattern. But again, that's something you kind of go with the flow with as you go. The next piece of common information that you're going to be given is the size, or sizes, depending on what you're making. And that'll tell you either what size it is when it's finished, so how big each individual piece is, or how big the full item is at the end, and then the knitting gauge that you need to get that. So we'll talk a lot more about gauge. I'm only mentioning it now as something that you will be seeing in patterns. Do not worry about it at this point. It's something to be aware of, but we'll talk a lot more about it. The next thing you'll see is, all going well, a list of abbreviations. So knitting is a lot of shorthand. So if you wrote out a full knitting pattern word for word, it could take huge amounts of paper, and there is a shorthand for doing it, and those are abbreviations. The most common abbreviations you'll see will be a K is a knit, a P is a purl, and then you'll see all your increasing and decreasing and all sorts of other things in there as abbreviations. Some patterns will assume you know what they are. So for example, you might see knit two together, knit the next two stitches together, and they won't tell you how to do that. Or some patterns will then go on and expand on that. Varies quite a bit, but again, you will get used to seeing different abbreviations, and most patterns will tell you exactly what to do with those. And then on top of that, depending on the designer or the complexity of the pattern that you're following, you might see a schematic which shows you all the very specific measurements. You'll often see those with sweaters. You might have special stitch instructions, charts, notes from the author, how to substitute yarn, other construction details, so it'll vary quite a bit depending on the designer and the complexity. Again, you'll see different things as you go through your pattern reading journey, so nothing to remember right now, just things to be aware of. So all of those are generally things that appear at the start of your pattern. So right up at the start where the designer kind of gets you ready to go, I recommend always reading those sections, kind of being aware of any kind of tricky bits that might be in there that you might not be aware of. Really great to read all the way through those pieces before you begin the actual pattern. Then the actual pattern. Now the information in here will vary wildly depending on the complexity of the item. We are going to start with very basic patterns. So this week we're going to look at some of the most basic. And then when we go on and we look at the hat pattern for weeks 3 and 4 of this class, you will get a really good idea of what a basic knitting pattern looks like for a hat. Having said that though, most patterns will tell you what kind of cast on and the number of stitches you must cast on. So that's all about getting your project onto needles. The next thing is they will give you section by section instructions. So for example, in the case of a hat, you might have the rib, the main body of the hat, and the crown of the hat. If it was a sweater, it might be body, back and front, sleeves, neck, etc. So it's broken down, the instructions are generally broken down into easy to follow sections. Then at the end of each section or each piece, or depending on how it's constructed, you'll be told when and where to cast off as well. Then after that, there's any finishing and care details. So finishing is those bits where you're putting your project together. So it'll tell you if you need which bits to sew to which bits to kind of wash and block, if you need to add a button band or anything. A lot of that is in the finishing towards the end of it. So it'll say, you know, when you finish a jumper, you'll have 2 sleeves and a body, and then you're like, how do I put these together? All of that information is generally in the pattern so that you can put that together. And then of course, how to look after your garment as well. May or may not be in there. A lot of them will tell you to look at the ball band or the skein band depending on what you're knitting it with. And again, it's like anything. You take good care of any piece of clothing and knitting is no different. So let's start with something very basic. This is a piece of stocking stitch knitting. So if you've been looking at the videos, we've talked about stocking stitch as a knit row, then a purl row, then a knit row, and then a purl row. And that eventually builds up into what we call stocking stitch. And this is what a pattern for a piece of stocking stitch might look like. Here I have told you what yarn, how to substitute the yarn, the needles that you're going to need. I tell you that gauge doesn't matter. And when you're practicing something, gauge doesn't matter. It's more about the technique. I then include 2 abbreviations. So a K in the pattern means knit and a P means purl. So you're going to do knit stitches or purl stitches. And then underneath I have a very basic pattern. It tells you to use the knit cast on, which is the one that we've been practicing as part of Learn to Knit. You must cast on the number of stitches, which is 20 stitches. Then in row 1, you want to knit to end. And then in row 2, you must purl to end. And the reason that you look at knit and purl is that it's K for knit and P for purl. Now, in row 1 and row 2, you will see knit to end. And you're probably thinking, what does that mean? And this is a shorthand way of in knitting of writing to the end of the row or to the end of the round. So when you see knit to end, it means knit all the stitches to the end of the row. And if it says P to end, it means purl all the way to the end of the row. There are alternatives to this as well. So it might say row 1, knit all stitches. And row 2 might say purl all stitches. And they both mean the same thing, they're just written slightly differently. So when you see a new pattern, there are different conventions that you will see used, but they can mean the same thing and you'll get the exact same result. And it is experience that will show you how those are. But we'll also talk about lots of those different things that you will see in patterns as we go through this course. Right now though, we're going to use knit to end and purl to end to mean knit all the stitches to the end of the row. And you can see why knit K to end is much shorter and more compact than writing knit all the stitches to the end of the row. And that's why in knitting things get shortened down quite a bit. The next instruction that you're going to see is work rows 1 and 2 a total of 10 times, which is a total of 20 rows. And this is something that you see a lot of in knitting. It'll tell you what the instructions are, and then it will tell you how many times you're going to work them. So in this case, it means you work 1, 2, rows 1 and 2 once, then twice, all the way to 10 times. And in there, each time you're doing a time, you're doing 2 rows. And that's something, again, that can be written in a number of different ways. You might also see here, work rows 1 and 2 another 9 times, a total of 18 rows, which means that they expect you to have knitted rows 1 and rows 2 before reading the repeat. And different designers will use different ways of saying a number of times. And as you come to a pattern, look very carefully at what they're telling you. Are they telling you a total number, or are they telling you more of? And that's something that you will see in different patterns and that you will get used to, but I'm highlighting it here as something that's really interesting. So here I'm telling you, I want you to do rows 1 and 2 10 times, a total of 20 rows. And then at the end of that, I'm asking you to cast off all of the stitches. The interesting thing about the cast off all stitches is that I haven't told you what cast off to use. I've done that deliberately because I want you to think about what to do if you're not told how to cast something off. So I want you to use the cast off that we've learned so far in Learn to Knit, and there's only one. But if you were doing another project and you had to do a cast off and you knew a number of cast offs, there are different ways of picking different cast offs. And we'll talk a bit more about that later on as well, but it's just something to be aware of now as you learn how to read patterns. I've told you which cast on to use, but not which cast off. And you might see it sometimes you're told which cast off, but not which cast on. And it's just something to know. It's a quirk of knitting to be aware of, but definitely not something to be worried about. So this pattern is one of the most basic patterns that you can see. And it's a really good idea to now practice. You've been learning how to do stocking stitch. It's now a good idea to combine knowing how to do stocking stitch with what it looks like in patterns. Because not only do I have the instructions here under pattern, but you might actually just see the instruction cast on 20 stitches, work stocking stitch for 2 inches and then cast off. You might not actually be told how to work stocking stitch. The pattern may assume that you know it. And stocking stitch, rib and garter stitch are some of the most common stitches that you're going to see written like that, which is why we start with them as the stitches you learn how to do, followed by how they appear in patterns. So at this stage, you're probably thinking, I will never remember all of those things. The great news is that you do not have to remember everything. Knitting is not a memory test. I genuinely mean that. There are times I've been knitting since I was 7, which is over 30 odd years ago, and I will still look things up. I knit every day, but I will come across something and I'll think, let me just check how that's done again. Or I'll see something that a designer has written in a way that I'm not used to seeing it, and I'll think, do they mean this? And I will look that up to be sure of it. So remember, you only have to be aware of things so you know that they exist as concepts, but you do not have to remember them all. Don't ever think about it. It's not emergency surgery where you're the doctor and you have to remember whether something is the liver or the kidney. If you can't remember which is a knit and a purl or which is a decrease and an increase, you can pause and look them up. So that's what I want to say at this point. Don't worry, you don't have to remember everything. The next thing then is that you don't need to know how to do everything in a pattern to knit the pattern. Knitting, again, is one of those things that you can practice a little bit at a time as well. So you can look things up. If it's not familiar to you, there's plenty of places to check. It's one of the big reasons I started knit school, because there can be confusion. And it's okay, because you have plenty of resources that you can check on where things are. So if you can't do it, you can always find out. Again, there isn't an emergency. And then, as I was saying about building your pattern skills over time, it's like knitting. You learn how to cast on, knit and purl and cast off, and then you learn how to increase and decrease. And as you learn your new skills, you can also learn how they appear in patterns, and it's something you build up to gradually. None of us started reading fancy Shakespearean plays when we started reading, and I suppose I've not read that many of them either, to be fair. And actually, that's quite a good example. So for example, if you think about how Shakespearean plays are presented, they're presented in English. Generally, they were written originally in English, but they were written in what we would think of now as an old version of English that we no longer use. And sometimes knitting is a bit like that. You see a term and you think, that might mean something, I know what it is, but I don't know what the term is. And then you can just kind of look it up, find out what it is, and then go from there. And it's a bit like that with Shakespearean English. Sometimes you need to decode it into your own understanding of what it is and move from there. So that's what I would say about knitting patterns is give yourself time. Remember, you don't need to know everything and you don't need to remember everything. And knitters who've been knitting for many, many years don't know everything either. We will come to things in patterns and go, what is that? And then you'll just find out and you'll have the confidence to keep knitting, and that's actually the core piece of it. And so with that said, in the Learn to Knit Combining Stitches and Pattern Reading booklet for this class, you will find some patterns for a stocking stitch, a garter stitch, and a rib stitch square. So do have a look at how they look as patterns. And you'll also find some alternatives in there to kind of what instructions you might see in different patterns. Have a look at them, then practice your knitting from those patterns so that you know both how to knit the pieces but also what they look like in patterns. And when you can link those two pieces of knowledge together, you're ready, really ready to continue your knitting journey into next week when we will be looking at your first knit hat.